Whether it's morning, evening, or afternoon where you are. I hope you're having a fantastic build so far. This session is Build Messaging and Integration Apps on Azure. My name is Matt Farmer. I'm a program manager in the Logic Apps team. Ably assisting me on the keyboards today doing Q&A is Kevin Lamb from the messaging team. We'll be taking you through a solution and some updates about Azure Service Bus, Azure Event Grid, and Azure Logic Apps. Quick walk through the agenda we're going to be covering. We're going to start with a hypothetical scenario to help you kind of frame what we're doing with these services and how you can use them. I'm going to jump into a demo and show you how you can very quickly build an integration solution that solves the problem we talk about for our hypothetical scenario, that hopefully helps you really understand where you can get started and what these services can do for you. Then we're going to jump into some quick announcements of stuff that's new either right now or coming very soon with these services. And then we've got some time for questions and answers. So if there's a burning issue you want us to tackle or talk about, please jump on and send us your questions. So without further ado, let's get started with our scenario. So the agenda said coffee, and we're going to talk about a hypothetical customer here. We're going to call them Contoso Coffee, but hopefully it's a scenario that is relevant to many of us at the moment with the current challenges we're all going through with COVID-19. So Contoso Coffee obviously is a coffee vendor, and they have a whole bunch of stores, very loyal customers who come and purchase their products. But the situation we're in has meant that their customers haven't been able to come to their stores and buy their products. How can they engage where their customers are, which is at home, with delivery services? And what would the Contoso Coffee do to really quickly integrate those services into their technology so they can meet their customers where they are? So we're going to talk about how Azure can help them with this particular scenario, engaging with delivery services. So let's look at Contoso Coffee's current infrastructure. It's pretty simple. They have a bunch of servers that they run in their own data center. That runs things like their public website, but also talks to their electronic point of sale systems in their stores. Now, obviously, they have developers. So what they could do is just build all the technology they need to integrate with delivery services themselves, and they could write a whole bunch of software to do that. But is there an easier way, and can Azure help them here? So what we would suggest to them is to start off looking at something like Azure Service Bus. Azure Service Bus is a platform as a service message queue in the cloud that they can provision in a few minutes, and they can easily send messages to it with HTTP. So they don't have to build a lot of software and infrastructure to do that. They merely take their existing systems and call out to Service Bus with an HTTP call. Then we're going to look at Azure Event Grid. Now, Azure Event Grid allows you to build event-driven applications really easily. So we can alert when messages arrive. I'm going to talk about why that's really important in a minute. But we'll show you how you can link Service Bus and Event Grid and then have the messages that Event Grid sends consumed. And we're going to consume those with Azure Logic Apps. Now, the pattern I'm going to show you shows Logic Apps reacting to an Event Grid message and then using what we call the peak lock. So being able to look at the message on Service Bus, try and process it, and then if it's successful, take it off the queue. If not, leave it there. Now, Logic Apps can also complete this journey for us by then calling out to the delivery services and email or any other we need to perform. So we're going to keep this pretty simple. Hopefully this gives you an idea of how quickly we can stitch these services together to make a really useful extension of Contoso Coffee's infrastructure. Let's jump over to the demo. So here we are in the Azure portal, and I have my service bus already set up. So I've provisioned it and set it up ready to go. And I've also already created the coffee orders queue. This is the queue that we're going to be sending order messages to. Now, imagine that customers are going to be creating orders either on an app or on the Contoso's public website, which already exist and are still running on their infrastructure on premises. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to connect to Event Grid. So that's going to alert when messages appear on the queue. So let's do that now. I'm going to click on the Events button on the left-hand side. Now, I have already got one set up because I am testing this, and this is a demo, but imagine this was the first time you do it. You would go into the Get Started button, and you can see here all the services we can trigger off with Event Grid and process the messages. I could use functions or just do it as a generic webhook or talk to other service bus instances. But in this case, I'm just going to run a logic app. So when I click on that, it starts up the logic app for me, and I just have to design it how I want to edit it. So the first thing we're going to do is connect to Event Grid. I already have a connection set up. As this is a demo, you'll have to connect in. But once I've done that, I can then configure it to react to service bus messages. And that's all I need to do right now. The next step I'm going to add is connecting to service bus. So I'm going to use the service bus action within logic apps. And what we're going to do is get messages from the queue with our peak clock pattern. Now I'm going to configure the queue that I'm going to talk to. You might ask, well, why is Event Grid telling us there are messages there and then we're going to get them? What Event Grid is doing is aggregating. It's kind of akin and similar to perhaps the notifications you might get on your phone saying you have messages to read. It's telling logic apps that logic apps has messages to read on the queue. Now is a good time to go and get them. So we go and get them from the service bus queue. We're going to get up to 20. We might only get one. We might get 20. We might get something in between. That's very efficient if we do that, if we do have a full queue. So the next step, because we could get up to 20 messages, and here's an example of where logic apps is very similar if you're a developer to a programming construct. So if I go into the built-in channel, we're going to use a for each. So for each loops around all the messages we've got in the array that service bus has returned us. So we're going to use the body of the message we got from service bus, and then the next step, we're going to do a few things. First thing we're going to do, a bit of defense in depth. We're going to make sure that the JSON that's being returned from service bus is valid. So nobody's inserted something that doesn't conform to my schema. So the first thing I'm going to do is just go and get an example. This is the sort of JSON I'm likely to get, my good trusty notepad providing it for me. I'm going to make sure that we're checking the current item. And then you could write a JSON schema. You're more than welcome to fill it in this place. It's not very much fun for me, I'll tell you that. So what I'm going to do is paste in an example and then generate the JSON schema from my example. Boom, done. Really simple. So now we're validating the messages that have come in and checking that they are conforming to our schema. Once we're happy with that, we can now send our order request off. So I'm going to use what's called a custom connector in Logic Apps. So here's one I've already created earlier. Now you'll notice this little logo here. This is one I added. This is a custom connector that I've created from the Open API definition that my delivery partner provided me. And by saving it as a custom connector, that means I can reuse it every time I want to talk to them without having to do any configuration talking to that API. I just treat it like another Logic Apps action. So we're just going to add in the parameter we want to call and then pass to that the current item. We validated it, so we can then pass it in. I could do other actions to that item. Whoops, don't need it twice. I could do other actions to that item. For example, I could add something to the JSON payload or take something out. For this one, I'm keeping it simple and just passing in that item. Then the next thing I need to do is send an email. So scroll to the bottom. I'm using Outlook 365 here. Obviously, if you were doing this in a kind of a production system, you might use something like SendMail. or SendGrid, sorry. It's entirely up to you. What I'm going to do is show you just how the parse JSON has also given me all the tokens that were available within that JSON payload for me to use. So I'm going to use the email address in the to line and then put your order. And this is where you get to see just how wobbly my desk is, because it's probably making my camera move all over the place. Your order ID, and then thanks for your order. Finally, we just need to do one more step, which is to complete the message on the queue. Now, when we said we were using a peak lock method, what operation on service bus, effectively what we did was reserved the group of messages that we wanted to try and process in the queue. We didn't remove them from the queue, we just took a lock on them. So this is why we're going to put a lock token back in this action here. If we decide that we have processed those messages successfully, then we can use the lock token to remove them from the queue so they don't get processed again. And there we have it. That's as simple as it is to set up that integration with Event Grid and Service Bus to process those messages. Now, we're going to test that, but I have one I prepared earlier, so I'm going to jump back to that and we'll move back to the Service Bus in a second. Right, just to go through the one I prepared earlier, because I added a few extra little features to it that make it even more robust. So just to call out that the scope here that I've wrapped the parse JSON order and send mail to, it's very much from a programming point of view similar to kind of a try catch. It wraps all those actions and says, depending on whether they succeed or fail, perform another action. So in this case, I've got the complete message action running on success. And then if it fails, I've got the dead letter queue, the message action running. So if I failed, something's wrong with the message, therefore I should put it in the dead letter queue. You could implement another logic app to use that. You could move it for, you could send it for human interaction to see what was wrong with it. It's up to you. Okay, let's go back to Service Bus. And what we're going to do now is jump into the queue itself. I'm just going to show you a new feature that's available this week. There you go, if I click on it correctly. New feature that's available this week, which is Service Bus Explorer. Now, this is a feature that's really been asked for a long time, and hopefully those of you who are using Service Bus already are going to be very pleased to see it. What this allows us to do is perform a number of actions on the queue directly here from in the Azure portal. So I can do a peek like I just did in the peek in the logic app I was configuring. I can do a receive. Be careful with that because it is destructive. So I can take the message from the queue, or I can just send, and that's what I'm going to do now. So I've pasted in my example message. I'm going to send it off. And then there we go. Instantly, we see one message appear on the queue. Now, if I refresh it, there we go. The message has disappeared, which means our logic app has done something with it. So let's go and see what it did. Now, with every logic app, I can go into the overview blade and see the run history for that logic app. So as we can see here, this logic app has just run. Let's jump in and look at the run history for it. So every logic app run records all the actions, inputs and outputs, and how they were processed. So I can see how long it took me, for example, to get the messages from Service Bus and see the message that came back from it. I can jump into the scope and in the individual actions there and see what happened. I can see the input and output from the API that I called. And it looks like I've been able to process it successfully. So there we go. We configured our service bus. We sorted an event grid handler on messages arriving. We wrote a logic app to process them, and then we integrated it with our messaging partner and sent an email. And we did that in a few minutes. Back to the slides. Okay, so once we've got this kind of infrastructure set up, it's pretty simple. Is there more that we could do with it? And the answer, of course, is yes. So at the most simple level, I could do something like I could put a logic app in front of Service Bus to do some pre-processing. So I could look up an order ID or customer loyalty information and things like that. I could allow partners to drop files into a blob storage in Azure that I could then process with a Logic App also. And I could trigger using Event Grid when those files arrived. I could pass messages into another service bus. And then if for example, I have ERP systems that support JMS messaging, they could reach in with JMS to talk to service bus. That's another new feature we're announcing this week. I could talk to databases if I was building them out in the cloud, like Cosmos DB or SQL. And if I want to get really interesting, I could do something like use Azure Cognitive Services to add some AI into my application that I was building out here in the cloud. So let's just quickly remind about those services. So Service Bus, Platform as a Service, enterprise ready for messaging. Event Grid, our way to build efficient event-based applications. And then Logic Apps allows you to build applications without writing code, but it's not a replacement for writing code. It allows you as a developer to build applications quickly and more efficiently and focus on the code that really matters to you. So let's quickly talk about what's new. So here's a summary slide, but I'm going to jump into a few things that are really interesting in this list. So for Service Bus, we're announcing public preview very soon of Java Message Service JMS support to over AMQP and large message support, supporting up to 100 megabytes in size. I know that's a top one on the list. For Event Grid, we now support partner topics. So this is a way in which third-party providers, the example here is Auth0, who's the first on that list, can generate Event Grid events for you to consume and use within your applications. Automation Hub is coming very soon, which will be popping up in the Azure portal and will allow you to create automation tasks very simply in the Azure portal. And the way in which we provision them is actually using things like Event Grid and Logic Apps under the hood, allowing you to schedule these tasks. And then once you've created them, you can go into the raw Logic App or Event Grid and configure them and modify them as you wish, or leave them as you want to. Allows you to really easily build these things up, but still have control. And then the final one on the list is Logic Apps running on the Azure Functions runtime. So this is going to be a whole bunch of new features packaged together with Logic Apps running on that Functions runtime, including, as you can see here, designer support in VS Code, allowing you to build your Logic Apps right in the IDE, in the VS Code IDE. And that's going to be previewing later this year. More on that one. I do a whole 20-minute demo on that, so you can dig in and get a lot more detail on that particular scenario if you head to the aka.ms.bot127 session. Some other next steps. What I talked about today isn't quite the sequential convoy pattern, but it doesn't take a lot more configuration to build out that pattern in Azure. So if you want to go and look at reference architecture that documents and walks through that, go and have a look at the sequential convoy reference architecture there. And we also have a reference architecture for all our Azure integration services. So Logic App, Service Bus, Event Grid, and API management. There's a bunch of reference architecture documents there you can go in and look at if you're considering building out this kind of architecture yourself. Final one, Int 161. Jeff Holland's delivering that session. If you haven't seen it already, build, integrate, and scale with event-driven apps. Takes a slightly different take on event-driven applications, but hopefully is very complementary to what you've heard about today already. Okay, we've got a few minutes for question and answers. Kevin, what have we got?
Sure, we got a bunch of questions coming in on the line. For the first one, we have a question about CI/CD. What is your recommendation on building Logic Apps and having it smoothly integrated in a CI/CD solution, Azure DevOps? Where should you develop, in the portal, Visual Studio, or Visual Studio Code?
That's a really good question, and one that I could probably answer for about 15 minutes, but I'll try a capsule answer. I think the core thing for developing Logic Apps and fitting that in with your DevOps lifecycle is ARM templates at the moment. So by generating that ARM template, you can then move the logic app between environments. We do have a feature in logic apps that allows you to parameterize the logic app template, which makes it very easy to swap out the tokens that you need to change between environments. That's kind of the answer right now. I think the answer longer term is we're putting a lot of focus on that developer scenario. And if you go and look at the demo I previously referred to, you'll see how some of this is going to change over time to make an even better experience in things like VS Code. So we'll have things like local project support, so you can package up your logic apps into a single project that you can then move through your CI/CD pipeline. So I would definitely recommend going and checking out that session, which hopefully gives you a flavor of where we're going with this.
That's great. Yeah, today we have integrated as part of the Resource Manager project that ability to go parameterize those logic apps, so you can have it integrated right away into your ARM templates. So that's today available in VS 2019.
Yep.
Okay, so the next question. This is a common one. A couple of them came up in different forms, but logic apps can consume service bus queue triggers directly. Why have event grid in the middle? What's the value proposition here?
Sure. Shall I get the one, or do you want to get that one?
I'll take that one.
Yeah, you take that one.
Service bus is a push-pull type of queuing system, which means that if you want messages from service bus, you have to go ask for them on the client side. So if you want to ask for them, you have to constantly be asking for those messages. So if you want immediate notification, the way that the Logic Apps connector is built is that it does a long pull for 30 seconds. So if you pull for every 30 seconds, you will get immediately notified that there's a service bus message, but you are required to have that polling mechanism in your trigger. With Event Grid, it's a push-push type of mechanism. So when a new message appears in service bus, that message gets notified through Event Grid with that subscription, and then the Logic app gets immediately woken up to say, hey, there's a message for you, go get it. So during those quiet periods, if you may not get messages for hours at a time, you're not busy polling every 30 seconds looking for that next message.
Excellent answer. Thanks, Kev.
Okay, next question. Can the Logic apps be integrated into SharePoint or Office 365?
Interesting. Okay, so there's a few different ways to answer this. So Logic apps absolutely can, and we have connectors for SharePoint and Office that you can run. I think depends what you want to do. The answer to your question may actually be Power Automate if you're looking for kind of user-based triggers of actions, and that integration is already there. So Power Automate shares a similar platform with Logic Apps, but is very much targeted at the power user, citizen integrator, citizen developer user group. So if you're building an application that you want to interact with SharePoint and Office 365, absolutely you can use Logic Apps to do that, use the connectors, and that will work just great. If what you're looking for is kind of user interaction, then I would suggest going and have a looking at Power Automate, and maybe a combination of Power Automate and Logic Apps, depending on whether it's an application you're deploying or enabling workflows for users. I hope that answers that question.
Okay, next question. Is it possible to use Logic Apps with other messaging queues like RabbitMQ?
Do you want to get that one, Kev?
Sure. So today, Logic Apps doesn't have a connector for RabbitMQ. RabbitMQ is based on AMQP 0.9, so it's not quite caught up with the latest specs for AMQP. But today, if you really want to get that ingestion from RabbitMQ, one of the schemes you can use is use an Azure function, which does have a binding for a RabbitMQ queue. And then you can have that function call Logic App. And so then there's a direct relationship between that function and Logic App. But there isn't a connector today for RabbitMQ.
I think just to call out on that one, if the RabbitMQ connector is something you really want, then have a look at our user voice, so feedback.azure.com, and leave your upvote there. That would be great.
And another good point, a plug for Logic Apps, is that Logic Apps allows you to build custom connectors just like your delivery system. So if there's a API or service that we don't have a connector for, you can go ahead and build a custom API really easily off of any REST or SOAP interface.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah.
Okay, are there any plans to unit test Logic Apps? There's a preview feature for mock but is there any feature on roadmap which will allow full unit testing of app?
Yes, there is. So hopefully, and again, I'm going to point back to the video, where we're going with Logic Apps is very much making that developer experience great. Now, we don't have this feature in the very immediate future, but what we want to do is add a few things on top of the static results, the mocking that you already see within Logic Apps. So you can certainly unit test in some ways with those static results, but what we also want to do is enable, give you a unit test framework and also do things like set breakpoint. So for example, you can, stop the Logic app, change some of the variables and continue just the sort of experience you'd expect when running code. So not in the absolute immediate future, but yes, it's something we're focused on and we'll be bringing to you.
Great. Let's see what's next on our list. What happens if the message body does not conform to the schema? How are errors processed and or reported? So I think that's with your parse JSON. You didn't go quite into a full-blown, production-ready logic app. And so I was looking to see how you handle that.
Yeah, so I think in the second one I showed you where you have a scope, that scope acts like a try-catch. So for example, if the parse JSON validation failed, that would have instantly dropped out of the scope, and you would have seen the dead letter message queue action running. So that's the pattern, in that we validate, see if it conforms to the schema, and then if it doesn't fail, drop out, go to dead letter queue, where that you can then choose what your business logic is around messages that are malformed.
Great. Is the 100 megabyte message size limit increase available in GA as of now? I think that's I
think that was June.
That was June. So it's a bit obscure. I assume they're talking about the new service bus capability for large messaging, as opposed to the message support that we have in Logic Apps. Right now, the 100 megabytes limit. If we see that customers are needing more, please add that to our user voice and let us know that, is it 101? Will it be a gig? Likely not, but who knows? Let's see how that starts getting consumed.
Cool. I think we've probably got time for one more question, Kev.
Okay, let's see. Well, I'll just go to the next one on the list. Probably I asked the same question yesterday, did not hear appropriate answer. We plan to move all EDI to Logic Apps, and the concern is if a customer's AS2 is down and we have the 1,000 failures, do we have a provision to resend all 1,000 in one shot?
Wow. Yes, we do. That sounds like a much more detailed answer. I would look at the log analytics template to do replay a whole group of messages at once. I think we could probably talk about that at length, but yes would be the answer, and I would steer towards the log analytics template for Logic Apps to look at that.
Well, it's unfortunate we have a number of other questions, but I think we've run out of time.
Yeah, very sorry, but you can always reach us on Twitter or through things like Yammer. So please do get in touch and let us know. Thank you very much for joining our session. Thank you for joining me here in my spare bedroom with the wobbly desk. We really appreciate your time and hope you're having a fantastic build. Thanks you very much.